Well, g'day everyone. Over the last month I've been using the Sony a9 Mark II. Thank you Sony for sending me this, and they gave it to me for a long period of time so I could really try it out over a number of shoots. So I'm really grateful for that. So I wanted to talk to you today about the difference between using, say, the a9 and the a9 II, some of the advantages that the a9 II has over the a9. Because I've used it sort of extensively, so now I can sort of really talk about the differences between the two, what are the differences, if they really matter, and things like that. So I thought I'd talk to you about the whole thing. Now, we'll be showing images that I've captured over the last month or so as we're discussing this camera, and I'll also be showing some things like video and stuff like that I've taken as well, because I have tried both stills and video, so I could sort of show both of these. So let's talk about what's common between the two cameras. They both have the same 24 megapixel sensor. In fact, I think it is the same sensor. I don't think that's been upgraded at all. The other thing that's the same is the viewfinder, the EVF. It's a 3.69 million dot viewfinder, and that's common between both cameras. The a9 II didn't get the high-res viewfinder that the A7R Mark IV has. It has the same 1.44 million dot rear screen, so that hasn't changed either. So that stayed exactly the same as the previous A9 model. So the ISO of both these cameras is ISO 100 to 51200 ISO, and it's expandable to 50 ISO to 204800. So they both have 20 frames per second electronic shutter. Now, the 20 frames per second is completely blackout free, so there's basically no dropout in the EVF at all. So it's like you're looking at real life when you're looking through the EVF of both of these cameras. So there's 693 phase detection autofocus points on this camera, and there's 425 contrast detection autofocus points. So both cameras also do 60 AF and auto exposure calibrations per second. Both cameras have real-time tracking. The A9 got that in a previous update just recently. Both cameras have 1/32,000th of a second in electronic shutter, and both cameras have 500,000 shutter actuations, which is really good. In other words, you'll probably never ever wear that out. So the main differences between the A9 and the A9 II are the buttons on here, and the body's slightly larger compared to the previous model, but the buttons are much more sort of pronounced and they're much larger and they feel much more tactile. When you click onto them, it does feel much better than what the previous buttons were. In fact, in my old camera, I had to use another system where it made the buttons a little bit larger just so I could feel these enough, whereas I don't have to do that when I'm using the A9 II. The grip as well is much nicer as well. You can see it still has the larger buttons that are sort of on this, and it does feel bigger in the hand. The body itself is larger, so if you do have sort of larger hands, get a better grip on the body, so that is much nicer if you're used to sort of the bigger digital SLRs. It's still not a big camera, but it does help if you have larger hands. There's also down here a button on the exposure compensation dial so that you can now lock this off from being hit. People were saying that when they were carrying that around or whatever, that this was changing in your bag and things like that, so that's why that's been changed. But overall, the camera body does feel much better than what the previous model was. It's got much better weather sealing now, sort of everywhere. Like everywhere now is sealed off, so you've got, you're much more reliable if you're carrying this around in the rain or something like that. Now the SD cards are much better in this model because they both support UHS 2, whereas before they only one did, and that's really nice. The other thing too is it's labeled now correctly with slot 1 at the top and slot 2 down the bottom. It was the other way around with the A9, so that's a much better sort of setup than what the previous camera had as well. Now the A9 II is also meant to have a slightly upgraded processor as well, which is meant to help with AF acquisition, particularly if you're dealing with tracking and things like that. Now there is a difference too in the mechanical shutter of this camera. The A9 could only do 5 frames per second, whereas the A9 II will do 10 frames per second. Now that can make a massive difference if you're dealing with things like flash, due to the fact that if you say capturing images that require flash, and often sports photographers and people like that will, particularly when I'm saying sports, if you're doing something like capturing skateboarders or something like this, skiers, where you need to freeze that moment and you wanted to use flash, that's where you have an advantage with having 10 frames per second. It can also help if you're dealing with working in very bad lighting environments where you may have a little bit of flickering and things like that, where you can then turn to mechanical and still get 10 frames per second. So the A9 was limited in the fact that you could only do 5 frames per second. Now the shutter on the a9ii is slightly better in the fact that it has less vibration. So if you are doing, say, a critical exposure like a long exposure or something like that, there is definitely less shutter shock from the shutter of this, and you can feel that if you're dealing between the two. There's also an anti-flicker mode. That's if you're dealing with fluorescent lights, and what that will do is it tries to get exposures between the variances of light. In other words, fluorescent lights will be flickering. Now you don't see that normally with your eye, but your camera will see that. So there can be variances in the exposure. So the beauty here is that the camera will determine what the correct exposure is and then try and balance those out each time. The unfortunate thing though, it doesn't work in video, so it will only work in mechanical mode on the camera, but it is an option that at least you have if you need it, if you're working in very bad lighting. And sports photographers often are in stadiums and places like that. Now there is much better connectivity with this camera as well. You can set up FTP servers and things like that with this camera, and that's one big difference between what the old camera had and the new camera. Both had networking, but this has been upgraded dramatically. Like I said, that part of it doesn't interest me because I'm not a sports photographer, but you know, you have to understand that it is there, and it will make a difference if you say shooting something like the Olympics or something like that where you have to get real-time images straight away. Now there is a little bit of a difference in the IBIS of both of these cameras. The A9 II will give you 5.5 stops, the A9 will give you 5 stops. Now that's not a lot of difference, and whether it makes any difference in real life, I'm not quite sure, but it is rated at 5.5 stops as against 5. So this camera, both cameras, both the A9 and the A9 II are amazing in video autofocus. The A9 II is meant to be slightly better in autofocus in video. I found them to be fairly close. And really, look, to be honest, I can't really tell much difference between the two if you're dealing with focus. One other big feature too of the A9 II is that you can record voice memos with this. Now that's really important for people like sports shooters and people like that want to give a memo of why they did this at that time or what that image was meant to represent. So that will be recorded with the file and even can be sent using the networking features as well. So that's a great feature. So what do I think about both cameras? I mean, how do I feel about it? Would I upgrade, say, the A9 to the A9 II? And I'll sort of sum up that near the end. But I just wanted to say, as a camera, the A9 II is incredible. I mean, it really is amazing. And they've just sort of expanded on what the A9, the original A9 has, and just given things like a better feeling body, better buttons. So the ergonomics of the camera are much nicer to use. And if you've used the A7R4, you would understand what I'm saying, that the ergonomics are much nicer to use. If you like a bigger grip, that's another thing as well, that the grip is much nicer if you have larger hands, so that's also an advantage. For autofocus between the two of them, I found both of them to be incredible. And I could really not tell much difference. I've used both sort of hand in hand and taken shots between the two of them. And I think Sony has done an absolute outstanding job with the A9 and also the A9 II. The A9 II probably is a fraction faster in focus acquisition, and it's a little bit stickier when it's grabbing the tracking. So there is an improvement there, but I wouldn't say that the original A9 is much worse. I mean, they're very, very close. It might be that it's just a fraction better. So if that matters to you, obviously the A9 II is the one to get. Video autofocus, very similar between the two of them. I found the IBIS to be very similar between the two of them, even though it's rated at 5.5 in the A9 II as against 5. I found that to be about the same. So let's talk about color science with these cameras. Sony have definitely improved the color straight out of the camera with the A9 II over the A9. It's a much more natural looking image now than what the previous camera had. In fact, I did a whole video about this if you wanted to watch it. But I do find that they're sort of of making advancements with each camera that they bring out now. So if you are dealing with getting the image correct straight away, like I said, if it was for the Olympics or something like that, where they will be using JPEG and sending them straight off, there's a definite advantage between, for going with the A9 II, due to the fact that the color science now is much more natural, and it's well, I wouldn't say it's much better, but it is definitely better than what the A9 is. It's interesting to me to talk about, would I upgrade my A9 to the A9 II? And in fact, I'm going to say no at this stage. And the reason for that is that I'm not a sports shooter. If I was a sports shooter, I probably would definitely upgrade, because I would want those networking features that are in there, the better weatherproof body that's in the camera, the dual card slots, which are both fast. So they're things that would matter to me if I was, say, shooting sports. I've been very spoiled with the A9, and I'm not probably the typical use case of having the A9, because I'm a wedding and portrait photographer, and I think the A9 is the best wedding photographer camera, or sort of event camera that I've ever used, and I adore it for that scenario. So for me personally, there's not enough in the A9 II to make me want to upgrade at this stage. Obviously, if something happens to my A9, I would definitely then upgrade to an A9 II. The interesting thing is, do you say keep the A9 or buy an A9 and then you'd have enough money for, say, a decent lens, like, you know, say getting the 24 GM, or do you upgrade immediately, or purchase the A9 II? And that's only a decision you can make. I suppose if you've got the money, I would just probably go and buy the A9 II straight away. But if you are struggling to sort of find those funds to buy a really nice camera and a really good lens, you may be better at the moment to buy the A9 and then also buy a good lens and save that money difference between buying an A9 II and an A9, the original A9. But overall, you just can't go wrong with either of these cameras. I think Sony have done a really great job. The autofocus, like I said, is unbelievable for both cameras. It's been slightly improved in the new camera. The color science, for me, was probably the biggest difference between the two of them. They've definitely made a sort of gain in the color science between the two cameras. Apart from that, though, I just think it's been a great release. And I wanted, like I said, I wanted to thank Sony for sending me the camera to review. And that's it for now, and I'll see you all soon in the next video. If you have any questions, please leave them down below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Bye for now.